Pam Bondi stood tall in the packed courtroom, her voice steady and sharp. "Your Honor, justice is not for sale." The words cut through the tense silence like a knife. Reporters scribbled notes. The jury leaned forward. Even the spectators in the back sat up straighter. But Judge Robert Callahan smirked. He adjusted his robe and looked down at her, amusement flickering in his cold eyes. "Miss Bondi, let's not turn this into a campaign rally," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "You are here to present a case, not to put on a show. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy." A few chuckles echoed in the room. But Pam didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on the judge, her expression calm but firm. "I'm here to expose the truth," she replied, her voice unwavering, "and the truth doesn't care who it makes uncomfortable." The chuckles stopped. The room fell into dead silence. For the first time, Judge Callahan's smirk faded. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, the truth would put him in handcuffs. Pam Bondi took a steady breath, her posture unshaken as she continued her statement. But before she could get past her second sentence, Judge Callahan raised a hand and let out a quiet chuckle. "Miss Bondi," he said, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher, "I hope you came prepared, though I doubt you have much of a case." A few murmurs ran through the courtroom. Spectators exchanged glances. The jury members looked at each other, their expressions unsure. Even the defense attorney, who had been expecting an easy trial, glanced up, as if sensing something was off. Pam remained composed, her face unreadable. "I assure you, Your Honor," she replied smoothly, her tone controlled, "this case is built on facts, not opinions." Judge Callahan smirked, leaning back in his chair with an air of absolute authority. "Facts?" he scoffed, tapping his fingers against his desk. "That's a bold claim. From what I've seen so far, all you have is speculation and a desperate attempt to stay relevant." A few people in the audience gasped. A reporter scribbled furiously in their notepad. Pam's grip on the podium tightened slightly, but her face didn't show the slightest crack. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Your Honor, I was under the impression that this courtroom was a place for the law to speak," she said, her voice sharp yet steady. "Not for personal opinions." Judge Callahan's smirk flickered for a brief moment, almost too fast to notice, but then it was back. "Careful, Miss Bondi," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "I could hold you in contempt." The tension in the room spiked instantly. But Pam didn't back down. She simply took a step forward, placing her hands firmly on the table in front of her. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice just a bit stronger now, "I believe the real question is who exactly is in contempt of the law today." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. For the first time, Judge Callahan's fingers stopped tapping. His smirk wasn't quite as confident anymore. And in the front row, a reporter whispered to another, "This just got interesting." A slow, deliberate smile crossed Pam Bondi's lips. She could feel the tension in the room tightening like a noose. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but carrying weight, "before we continue, I'd like to submit additional evidence into the record." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sealed folder. The golden seal of the Justice Department gleamed under the bright courtroom lights. The room stirred immediately, whispers rippling through the audience, reporters leaning forward, cameras clicking. Even the jury members exchanged glances. Pam walked toward the clerk's desk, her heels clicking against the polished courtroom floor, the sound echoing in the silence. She placed the folder down carefully. Inside this file is a detailed financial paper trail that links Judge Robert Callahan to multiple illegal bribes, she announced, her voice crisp, precise, and unwavering. A sharp gasp came from the back of the room. Someone muttered, "Did she just say the judge?" Up on his bench, Judge Callahan's smirk vanished. His fingers, which had been casually tapping a rhythm just moments ago, curled into a fist. "Enough," he snapped, his voice suddenly colder. This is an insult to the judiciary, and I will not allow such theatrics in my courtroom. Pam turned to face him, calm as ever. Your Honor, she said smoothly, these documents were obtained legally. They contain bank records, offshore account transfers, and confidential emails, all of which point directly to you. The jury's eyes widened. The murmurs grew louder. A reporter fumbled for their phone, likely sending out a breaking news alert. Judge Callahan let out a short, dry laugh, shaking his head as if this was all a bad joke. You're overstepping, Miss Bondi, he sneered. You have no proof, no credibility. This is a desperate stunt, and I won't tolerate it. Pam took a step forward. The confidence in her eyes didn't waver. Oh, but I do have proof, Your Honor, she said. And in just a moment, the court will hear from a very special witness who can confirm every word. A beat of silence. Judge Callahan's jaw tightened. He gripped the edge of his desk. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. And the whole room felt it. Judge Callahan let out a forced chuckle, shaking his head as if Pam's words were beneath him. But the way his grip tightened on the edge of his desk told a different story. This is nonsense, he declared, his voice loud and firm, trying to regain control of the room. These so-called documents are irrelevant and completely inadmissible. I will not allow this circus act in my courtroom. The crowd stirred uneasily. A few whispers passed between reporters, pens scratching furiously against notepads. The jury members shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking between Pam and the judge. Pam, standing tall, didn't move an inch. Her expression remained steady, her eyes locked on the man, desperately trying to protect himself. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said, her voice razor-sharp, you don't get to decide which evidence matters when it concerns you. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Callahan's face darkened. His fingers drummed against his desk in an erratic rhythm, his frustration peeking through the cracks in his usual composure. You're walking a dangerous line, Miss Bondi, he warned, his voice lower now, laced with quiet fury. I strongly advise you to tread carefully. Pam didn't flinch. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. No one is above the law, Your Honor. Her words hung in the air like a direct challenge. The murmurs in the room grew louder. People were no longer just spectators, they were witnesses to something historic. Judge Callahan slammed his gavel down once twice. Hard. I will not allow this courtroom to be turned into a media spectacle, his voice thundered across the room. If you continue with this baseless attack, I will hold you in contempt. Pam just tilted her head slightly, studying him. I think the real question, Your Honor, is whether you should be the one holding the gavel right now. A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Judge Callahan's face twitched. He was losing control, and everyone knew it. And for the first time, he knew it too. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Callahan gripped his gavel as if it was the last thing keeping him in control. His face was blank, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Pam Bondi took a measured breath before turning to the clerk standing near the witness stand. The prosecution calls Mr. Daniel Reeves to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom. All eyes turned to the man stepping forward, Daniel Reeves, a former senior court clerk who had worked under Judge Callahan for nearly a decade. His steps were slow, hesitant, as if he were carrying a heavy burden with every movement. Judge Callahan's fingers tightened around the gavel. Pam's gaze never left the judge. Do you recognize this man, Your Honor? Judge Callahan's smirk faltered. I may have seen him before, he muttered. I've had many clerks over the years. Pam nodded, then shifted her attention back to Daniel. Mr. Reeves, please state your occupation for the record. The clerk swallowed hard. I was a court clerk in this courthouse for 12 years, he said, his voice just above a whisper. Pam stepped forward. And how many of those years did you work directly under Judge Callahan? A pause. Daniel finally lifted his gaze, locking eyes with the judge. 8 years. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Judge Callahan leaned back in his chair, forcing a dry chuckle. And what exactly does that have to do with this case? Pam's tone remained calm but sharp. "Mr. Reeves, could you please tell the court what you told investigators about your time working under Judge Callahan?" Daniel hesitated. He glanced at the exit, as if reconsidering his decision. The moment stretched. Then, finally, he took a deep breath and faced the jury. "Judge Callahan manipulated cases," Daniel said, his voice shaky but clear. He accepted bribes. He fixed rulings in favor of people who could pay him." The courtroom exploded in gasps. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. Someone dropped a pen, the small noise echoing through the stunned silence that followed. Judge Callahan's jaw tightened. His face reddened, but he quickly masked it with another forced smirk. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed. "This man is clearly lying." Pam's voice remained steady. "Mr. Reeves, do you have proof?" Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black notebook. "This is my journal," he said. "For years I kept notes, names, case numbers, amounts of money exchanged. Too was scared, but I couldn't keep silent anymore." Pam turned towards the judge. "Your Honor, would you like to dismiss this as irrelevant too?" Judge Callahan said nothing. His grip on the gavel was now white-knuckled. And for the first time the jury looked at him not as a judge, but as a criminal. A thick silence hung over the courtroom. The tension was palpable, stretching like a wire ready to snap. Pam Bondi didn't rush. She let the weight of the whistleblower's testimony settle over the room before moving to the next blow. She reached into her folder and pulled out a stack of documents, neatly clipped together. The paper rustled softly, but in the dead quiet courtroom, the sound felt deafening. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but piercing, "I'd like to submit additional evidence into the record." Judge Callahan forced a smirk, but the muscles in his jaw were visibly tight. "Oh, what now?" he scoffed, trying to sound dismissive. Pam walked toward the court clerk's desk, setting the documents down with careful precision. "These," she continued, "are official records of offshore bank accounts registered under the name Robert Callahan." A collective gasp swept across the courtroom. Reporters snapped their heads up. The jury members shifted in their seats. Pam continued, flipping to the next page. "Each deposit coincides exactly with key rulings in this courtroom. The transactions align with cases where the defendants' wealthy, powerful individuals were all mysteriously acquitted." She turned her gaze to the jury, making sure they saw what she was seeing. "This isn't speculation," she said. "This is a financial trail. It's hard proof that justice wasn't just ignored, it was sold." Judge Callahan's face paled. A single bead of sweat trickled down his temple, but he was quick to wipe it away. "This is absurd," he said, his voice sharper now, less controlled. "These documents are fabricated. I've never seen them before in my life." Pam simply lifted a brow, her confidence unshaken. "Is that so?" She turned back to the papers. "Because the accounts were traced back through your social security number, your personal tax records, and, most importantly," she paused for effect, then flipped to the last page, "your signature." Judge Callahan's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Pam tapped the page lightly. "Would you like to deny your own signature as well, Your Honor?" The judge shifted in his seat, his hands now clenching the edge of his desk. His once arrogant posture had changed. He no longer looked like the one in control. Pam took a slow step back, letting the silence sink in. She could see it now, the panic setting in behind his eyes. And the best part? She wasn't even finished yet. The weight of the evidence hung heavy in the air. The once commanding presence of Judge Robert Callahan was now reduced to a man gripping onto the last threads of his authority. His face, usually so composed, was flushed with anger, his knuckles white as he clutched the edge of his desk. For a long moment he said nothing. Then suddenly he snapped. "This is outrageous," he bellowed, his voice booming across the courtroom. His gavel slammed down with a sharp crack, but instead of restoring order, it only fueled the tension. "You think you can take me down? You're just another overambitious prosecutor looking for headlines." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The jury members exchanged glances, but not out of doubt, out of realization. The arrogance, the bravado was all crumbling. This wasn't confidence. It was fear. Pam Bondi remained perfectly still. She didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't even blink. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving the judge. The room seemed to shrink, the weight of the moment pressing in on every spectator, every reporter, every juror. And then, with complete control, she spoke. "Your Honor, I suggest you compose yourself. You're making this case easier for me." The words landed like a thunderclap. The tension in the room shifted. No longer was Judge Callahan the one in control. Pam was, and the whole courtroom knew it. Reporters' pens scratched furiously against their notepads. Camera shutters clicked, capturing the moment a powerful judge came undone before their eyes. Judge Callahan opened his mouth, then shut it. His breathing was heavier now, his eyes darting toward the sealed evidence on the desk. His downfall was playing out in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Pam tilted her head slightly. "Shall we continue?" The judge's jaw clenched. He couldn't respond, because he had already lost. Judge Callahan gripped his gavel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breathing was uneven, his frustration bubbling over as he tried to salvage what little power he had left. "I have heard enough," he barked, slamming the gavel down with a thunderous crack. "All of this so-called evidence is stricken from the record. This case is over." The jury froze. The audience stirred uneasily. Even the defense attorney looked stunned. Pam Bondi didn't react. She simply folded her arms, watching him with a knowing calm. And then, a commotion erupted outside the courtroom. Muffled voices, the sharp clatter of hurried footsteps, the heavy creak of the courtroom doors being thrown open. Every head in the room snapped towards the entrance. And there they were, FBI agents and U.S. Marshals, moving in with unwavering authority. Their dark suits, their earpieces, the bulletproof vests, there was no mistaking who they were here for. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, holding up an official document for all to see. His voice rang out clear and firm. "Judge Robert Callahan, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, bribery, and conspiracy." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Gasps, shouts, reporters scrambling to grab their phones, the audience rising to their feet, whispering in disbelief. The jury members sat frozen, unable to look away. And at the center of it all, Judge Callahan sat motionless. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His eyes darted wildly from the officers, to the evidence, to the courtroom full of people, watching his downfall unfold. "No, this is a mistake," he sputtered, his voice suddenly hoarse. "You can't do this. I am the law." The FBI agent stepped closer. Not anymore. 2 U.S. Marshals moved in, reaching for his arms. Judge Callahan jerked back violently. "Get your hands off me," he snarled, his voice bordering on hysteria. But there was nowhere to run. As the marshals secured his wrists in handcuffs, the cameras flashed in rapid bursts. Reporters spoke frantically into their microphones. Pam Bondi watched it all, her expression unreadable. She had come here for justice. And now, the most powerful man in the courtroom was nothing more than a convicted criminal in handcuffs. The tension in the courtroom had reached a boiling point. The once mighty Judge Robert Callahan sat frozen in his chair, his face drained of all color. Shock, disbelief, panic. It all flickered across his features as the FBI agents moved in. The lead agent took a firm step forward, holding out his badge. "Judge Callahan, stand up." Callahan's fingers dug into the armrests of his chair. His body was stiff, unmoving, his breathing heavy and uneven. The courtroom was still, every set of eyes locked onto him. The jury, the spectators, the reporters all waiting to see what he would do. "I said stand up," the agent repeated, his voice firmer now. Callahan's head snapped up, and suddenly, rage replaced the fear in his eyes. "This is a mistake," he bellowed, slamming his fist onto his desk. "You can't do this to me. I am the law." Gasps rippled through the room. Pam Bondi watched silently, her face unreadable, but her eyes sharp as steel. The FBI agent didn't flinch. "You were the law, Callahan, now. You're just another criminal." The marshals moved in swiftly. The moment their hands touched his arms, Callahan jerked back violently, knocking over a stack of legal papers. "I said get your hands off me," he roared. But there was nowhere left to run. With trained precision, the two U.S. Marshals grabbed his wrists and forced him onto his feet. The judge thrashed wildly, his face red with fury. "This is an attack," he spat, his voice bordering on hysteria. "A political setup. You'll all regret this. I'll have every single one of you fired." Click! The metallic sound of handcuffs, snapping shut on his wrists, rang through the silent courtroom. The once powerful judge stood there, shackled, his chest rising and falling in quick, furious breaths. He tried to yank free, but the steel held tight. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters jumped from their seats, cameras flashing like lightning, capturing the downfall of a man who once ruled this very room. Pam Bondi remained still. She had done her job. She had exposed him. And now she was watching him face the consequences. A swarm of reporters descended upon her, firing questions. "Miss Bondi, did you expect this outcome? How long have you been investigating Judge Callahan? What does this mean for the justice system?" She turned toward the flashing cameras, her expression cool, controlled. And then, in a voice calm but firm, she simply said, "No one is above the law." The crowd outside the courthouse was electrified. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, cameras rolling, microphones extended, all waiting for the woman who had just taken down one of the most corrupt judges in the country. Pam Bondi stepped through the heavy courthouse doors, the bright afternoon sun hitting her face as she descended the steps. The moment her heels touched the pavement, a wave of flashing cameras and shouting reporters crashed toward her. "Miss Bondi, what does this mean for the legal system? Did you always believe Callahan was guilty? How long was this investigation in the works?" Pam raised a hand, signaling for quiet. The chatter died down, the tension hanging in the air like a final verdict waiting to be spoken. She stood tall, her voice carrying over the restless crowd. "No one is above the law, not a businessman, not a politician, and certainly not a judge." A murmur ran through the crowd, followed by a sudden eruption of applause. The people standing behind the reporter, citizens, legal activists, even former victims of Callahan's courtroom ruling, cheered loudly. Pam let the moment settle before continuing. "For too long, power has protected the corrupt. People like Judge Callahan believe that their position, their influence, their connections make them untouchable. But today proved something different." She glanced back at the courthouse. "Today, the law proved that it serves the people, not the powerful." More applause. Some in the crowd even whistled. A reporter in the front row leaned forward. "Miss Bondi, what's next? Do you think there are more cases like this?" Pam's jaw tightened slightly. She had spent months, years uncovering the web of corruption behind Callahan, and she knew he wasn't the only one. She met the reporter's gaze. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice steady as steel. "There are more like him, and one by one we will find them." The crowd erupted again. Pam turned slightly, spotting a young law student standing in the back, eyes shining with admiration. The girl wasn't holding a mic or a camera, she was just there, watching, taking it all in. Pam gave her a small nod, a silent message. The fight wasn't over. But today was a victory. The cold steel bars of the holding cell slammed shut, the finality of the sound echoing through the empty corridor. Judge Robert Callahan, the once feared figure of the courtroom, now sat alone on a hard cot, his hands still stiff from the tight grip of the handcuffs that had been removed minutes earlier. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting an unflattering glow on his now pale, sweat-drenched face. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his once perfectly combed hair now disheveled from the chaos of his arrest. This couldn't be happening. He had spent decades building his empire web of power, influence, and carefully placed favors. He had been untouchable, above the law, and yet here he was. Callahan's fingers twitched as he reached for the small phone mounted on the wall. He knew his right she was entitled to one call. He dialed a number he had memorized years ago. The phone rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. Frowning, he tried again. This time he called an old friend of the senator's who had once benefited from his rulings. No answer. His heartbeat quickened. He tried another, a wealthy businessman whose fraud case he had dismissed in exchange for a hefty sum. Still nothing. One after another, he called his closest allies, the people who had once lined up to shake his hand, to whisper in his ear, to pay him for his favors. No one picked up. His grip on the receiver tightened. He slammed the phone down. They had abandoned him. For years they had stood beside him, laughing at the very laws they pretended to uphold. Now, with the floodlights of the FBI shining on him, they had vanished into the shadows, fearing that their own secrets would come spilling out next. Callahan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. His mind raced for a way out. He was still powerful, wasn't he? His eyes flicked to the small window on the steel door of his cell, just as two federal agents passed by. "Trial's scheduled for next month," one muttered to the other. "They're bringing in more witnesses. Looks like his entire operation is unraveling." Callahan's stomach twisted. More witnesses? He had spent his life silencing people with bribes and threats. But now, without his power, his money, his influence, there was nothing left to silence them. His empire was collapsing. And for the first time in his life, Judge Robert Callahan knew what it felt like to be completely, utterly powerless. Weeks had passed, but the moment had finally arrived. Robert Callahan, the once untouchable judge, now sat on the other side of the courtroom, dressed in a plain grey suit instead of his prestigious black robe. His hands rested stiffly on the defense table, his face unreadable, but his hollow eyes told the real story. He had spent years handing out sentences, deciding fates with the stroke of his gavel. Now, he was the one waiting for judgment. This time there was no grand mahogany desk between him and justice, no power to shield him, no allies left to protect him. At the prosecution table, Pam Bondi sat poised and ready, flipping through her case files one last time. This was it, the final chapter. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room fell into silence. The judge entered a stark contrast to Callahan. He was calm, collected, and most importantly, honest. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The trial began, and Pam took the stand. She spoke clearly, confidently, recounting the corruption, the bribery, the manipulation of justice. The evidence was airtight bank records, witness testimonies, and the very laws Callahan had twisted to serve himself. The jury listened intently, but their faces already told the story. They didn't need convincing. Callahan's defense team struggled to push back, arguing that the case was built on circumstantial evidence. But the documents, the offshore accounts, the bribery logsit was undeniable. And then came the most damning moment of the trial. Pam Bondi turned toward Callahan, her gaze unwavering. She didn't speak with malice, just certainty. "Justice isn't about power," she said. "It's about the truth. And today the truth speaks louder than any lie." Callahan shifted in his chair, his lips pressing into a thin line. He had been in enough trials to know this was over. The courtroom fell silent as the jury was dismissed to deliberate. But they weren't gone for long. Barely an hour later, they returned. The judge took his seat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A juror stood, clearing his throat. "We have, Your Honor." Everyone held their breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Callahan, guilty on all counts." A wave of murmurs swept across the courtroom. Reporters rushed to record the historic ruling. Pam exhaled slowly, victory settling over her like a quiet storm. The judge nodded, expression firm. "Robert Callahan, you are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for corruption and obstruction of justice." A hush fell over the room. Even Callahan didn't react at first. Then, as two U.S. Marshals approached him, reality finally sank in. His hands trembled, his breath grew uneven, and as the cold handcuffs locked around his wrists, he muttered under his breath, This can't be happening." But it was. For years, he had decided the fate of others. Now his own fate was sealed. With cameras flashing and the world watching, Judge Robert Callahan was escorted out of the courtroom not as a judge, but as a convicted felon. Justice had finally caught up, and this time there was no escaping it. The press conference room was packed wall to wall. Reporters, legal analysts, and citizens, eager to witness history, filled every seat. Camera lights flashed, microphones lined the podium, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Pam Bondi stood at the center, her presence commanding, her expression unwavering. She had spent months, even years, pursuing this case, and now, standing before the world, she was ready to deliver the final words on Judge Callahan's downfall. She took a slow breath, letting the crowd settle into silence. "This case was never about one man," she began, her voice steady but powerful. "It was about the principles of justice, the integrity of our legal system, and the idea that no one, not a businessman, not a politician, and certainly not a judge, is above the law." The room erupted in applause. Some people rose to their feet, clapping enthusiastically. Others nodded solemnly, absorbing the weight of her words. Pam let them have the moment. When the noise finally settled, she continued. "This victory was not mine alone," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I stand here today because of the tireless efforts of my team, the brave whistleblower who risked everything to tell the truth, and the FBI agents who refused to let corruption go unchecked." A camera zoomed in on Daniel Reeves, the former court clerk, sitting quietly in the front row. His eyes shone with emotion. For years, he had watched corruption rule the courtroom. Now, he had helped bring it down. "This wasn't easy," Pam admitted. Judge Callahan was powerful. He had friends in high places. He thought he could buy his way out, manipulate the system the way he always had. But he underestimated one thing. She paused, her expression turning sharp. "The will of the people." The crowd cheered again. Pam leaned forward slightly, her voice firm with conviction. "This is just the beginning. Corruption exists in many places, courtrooms, boardrooms, government offices, but this case sends a clear message. We will not stop. We will not back down. We will root it out wherever it hides." More applause erupted. Reporters jotted notes rapidly. Pam straightened, her final words clear and unwavering. "This is not just a win for the prosecution. It's a win for justice. A win for every person who has ever been silenced by power. And most importantly, it's a warning to those who think they can twist the law for their own gain." She glanced at the cameras, sending a silent message to whoever might be next. "Justice is coming, and we're just getting started." The crowd roared. Pam stepped back from the podium, the cameras flashing wildly as she walked off the stage, her mission far from over. The city was alive with celebration. News of Judge Callahan's conviction had spread like wildfire, dominating headlines across the country. Television screens flashed with breaking news banners, newspapers displayed bold front-page headlines. "Corrupt judge falls, justice prevails." Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered in triumph. People held signs that read, "No one is above the law," and "Justice wins." For many, this wasn't just about one man, it was about restoring faith in a system that had failed them for too long. Pam Bondi watched from her office window, a rare smile touching her lips. This was a victory, but she knew the fight was far from over. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. A young intern stepped in, holding a small envelope. "This came for you, Miss Bondi," she said, placing it on the desk before stepping out. Pam picked up the letter, curiosity flickering in her eyes. There was no return address. She opened it and unfolded the neatly written note. Dear Miss Bondi, I watched your press conference today. I want you to know that because of you, I believe in justice again. For a long time, I thought people in power always won, that corruption would always go unchecked, but you proved that's not true. I'm a law student. One day, I hope to stand where you stood and fight for what's right just like you did. Thank you for reminding me why the law matters. Sincerely, a future prosecutor. Pam read the letter twice. She had taken down one corrupt judge, but there were many more like him. There would be new cases, new battles, new enemies trying to twist the system to their advantage. But there would also be people like this student, the next generation of prosecutors, lawyers, and judges who believed in the fight for justice. She placed the letter carefully inside her desk drawer and leaned back in her chair, eyes sharp, mind focused. She wasn't done, not even close. She turned toward the window one last time, the sound of the city's celebration still echoing in the streets below. Her voice was quiet, but the words carried weight. Justice is not about power. It's about doing what is right even when the odds are against you. And with that, she reached for the next case file. Because justice never sleeps. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful courtroom dramas where justice prevails, make sure to subscribe this channel. We bring you gripping legal battles, shocking verdicts, and unforgettable moments of truth. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Justice never sleeps, and neither do we.